everyone. My name is Tunji Adeyemi. I'm a senior associate in the Nigerian law firm of Banwo and Godalo, and I'll be speaking on commencement of trade in the African Continental Free Trade Area. Essentially, try to highlight the key issues, opportunities, and challenges. So essentially, we will run through the status of intra-African trade, essentially prior to AfCFTA. We would look at how AfCFTA evolved, and then we will take a critical look at the framework agreements for AfCFTA. And of course, we will then delve into the key issues, opportunities, challenges, and then we'll conclude with a few questions if there are any. Now, despite having a combined population of over 1 billion people and GDP of around about $3.5 trillion, trade between African countries has been historically low. And if you just take just a certain period, 2015 to 2017, and just compare a few statistics, we would see that intra-African trade in Africa was just about 2%. Doing a comparative analysis with other continents, in that period was over 6-7% in Europe, almost 50% in America, 6-7% in Asia, and the least being 7% in Oceania. Now, conversely, if you look at exports of African nations to other countries in other continents, it averaged about 90% in the last 2 decades. Now, essentially what this makes us is the continent with the second highest export dependence on the rest of the world. Now, interestingly, the top 5 economies in Africa, and that would be Nigeria, South Africa, Egypt, Australia, and Morocco, they do not even feature in the top 10 intra-African exporter countries, which essentially means that the top economies in Africa are not even trading with each other. The resultant effect of this is very evident. Africa contributes very little to global trade, with current figures showing less than 3% contribution. I mean, if you then had a continent of 1 billion people, that's obviously potential trade opportunities that remain latent and virtually untapped. Of course, that has a cascading effect on, the economic performance, as it were, of the entire continent as well. Now, looking at how AfCFTA has evolved, it's not the first set of efforts, as it were, that African countries have tried to come together to form trade areas. Over the last few decades, dating back over a century ago, African nations have tried to come together to develop free trade areas. However, the biggest drawback of many of these efforts is that they were based on regional efforts. Okay, so take, for example, COMESA, which is the common market for East and South Africa. It's currently the largest free trade area at the moment, combined GDP of over 805 billion. Now, COMESA has witnessed a lot of countries withdrawing from the free trade area and some joining over the years. So even though it's the largest regional economic organization in Africa in terms of member states, and even in terms of combined geographical size, it has not done so much in jumpstarting intra-African trade. Now, we also have the East African Community, which was founded since 1967. But of course, it was dissolved after a few decades and only got reactivated in year 2000. They've launched a common market, they have a customs union in 2010, and they even have plans to be a full political federation, but up until now, nothing significant in terms of trade within that region. Now, ECOWAS is interesting because Nigeria is part of ECOWAS, so I can speak directly to this. ECOWAS was established in 1975 and it currently has 15 members. Now, within that small, and you need to see the map of Africa, particularly West Africa, to see how small, this region we're talking about is. Now, within that small region of West African states, of just 15 member states, this free trade area is still further divided into the English and the French speaking countries. And so you then have sub-regional blocks even within ECOWAS. So you have the West African Monetary Union that essentially is mostly comprised of the French-speaking nations. These ones have a common customs union and currency. And then you have the West African Monetary Zone. Now, again, for this free trade area, it's essentially dominated by Nigeria, which is currently the largest economy on the continent, looking at about 71% exports and roughly about 61% imports as well. There is the South African Development Community, which has about 16 member states, including South Africa. I won't say too much about this. But what I would say about the South African Development Community is that you also have the South African Customs Union, which interestingly is actually the oldest customs union in the world, dating back to 1889. Now, what is interesting is South Africa is a member of the South African Development Community and is also a member of the South African Customs Union. Now, the South African Customs Union has all the 5 countries that make up Southern Africa, okay? But over time, this particular free trade area, what we find is a number of countries have complained that South Africa dominates all decision making over the customs and excise policies in relation to this area. Again, there's the CEMAC, Economic and Monetary Community of Central Africa as well. I think it's also good to mention that there are a few other regional economic communities. Now, these communities are essentially not regarded as trade areas because their trade agreements have not been notified to the World Trade Organization, and that includes Arab Maghreb Union and the others highlighted particularly on this slide. So I guess the big question is, what's the impact of all these regional agreements that different African regions have had over the years? I mean, clearly it's had very limited impact. I just mentioned earlier that Africa contributes less than 3% to global trade. So it hasn't really jump-started intra-African trade or created any significant impact, involving African countries. And just doing a quick evaluation of some of the policy areas that have been covered by these sub-regional agreements, you would see that while they typically address issues on tariffs on manufactured goods, agricultural goods, they don't go deep enough to address very critical issues such as investment, such as export taxes, anti-dumping, or even technical barriers to trade. So clearly they've been very limited in terms of their impact. So now looking at the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, essentially this developed from an AU African Union summit that was held in March 2018. And in that summit that was held in Rwanda, 44 African countries signed. You need the framework agreement provided that just 22 countries are required to ratify, so beyond signing, to go further and ratify it in their various countries for it to take effect. And in just about a year, by April 2019, this was achieved. As of today, 54 out of 55 African countries have signed, and the only African country that has not signed is Eritrea, and that's because there was some conflict, with Ethiopia at that time, and now that there's been a peace agreement, they've notified the African Union that they are willing to sign up to AfCFTA. Now, what does the African Continental Free Trade Agreement essentially try to cover? First of all, it's a culmination of Agenda 2063. And for those who are not familiar with it, Agenda 2063 was developed by the African Union, and the idea really is that you would have a continental market where there's free movement of persons, of capital, of goods and services, okay, such that every person, capital, investment can move freely within the entire region. Now, the AfCFTA agreement acknowledged the current regional economic communities and the different free trade areas as building blocks that will be used to essentially establish the African Continental Free Trade Area. Now, what is the scope of AfCFTA? Now, it goes beyond covering issues on trade in goods and services. It seeks to address issues in relation to investment, even intellectual property rights and competition policies continent-wide. Now, the general objectives as stated in the agreement is to create a single and liberalized market for goods and services in Africa, and essentially lay a foundation to establish a continental customs union. And you know the way customs union work, which would then mean that import tariffs are exactly the same all over Africa, and goods can move freely, without any hindrance. And of course, it also seeks to resolve the challenges of multiple and overlapping memberships of different regional economic policies or regional economic communities, I beg your pardon, which has been the bane of different African countries prior to now. Now, just touching very quickly on the specific objectives of AfCFTA, it seeks to progressively eliminate tariffs and non-tariff barriers to trade in goods. And so clearly, there's a recognition that the only barriers to trade is not just tariffs. There are a lot of non-tariff barriers, and AfCFTA seeks to eliminate all these barriers so that goods can move freely within all African countries. Of course, it wants to liberalize trade in services as well, so that services that is rendered in one country can be rendered in all other countries, as it were. Issues in relation to investment, intellectual property rights, and of course, settlement of disputes. All of this will be addressed, as we go along with AfCFTA. Now, the core protocols of AfCFTA speak to some of these objectives that I've earlier mentioned: elimination of tariffs and non-tariff barriers, facilitating trade, and effectively looking at implementing a full liberalization of tariff barriers on over 90% of goods that are traded within the continent. Okay, and of course, addressing a dispute settlement body, that will address disputes in relation to trade on the continent, as it were. And it goes further to even have panels and appellate bodies and what have you. Now, speaking to the potentials of AfCFTA, which might be of interest to exporters here. Clearly, AfCFTA has been well received around the world, including major development finance institutions. For one, it's acknowledged that it has created the largest free trade area in the world. Just to do a bit of comparative analysis, the European Union has roughly about 22 countries out of the entire 44 countries that make up Europe. Now we are talking of a union in Africa that has every single African country. Like I said, as we speak today, we have 54 out of 55 African countries who have signed up to AfCFTA, and the only one that has been left out is pushing strongly to ensure that it's also part of AfCFTA as well. So it's been recognized as the largest free trade area in the world. It creates a market of over 1.2 billion people, and it's going to be the eighth, largest economic bloc in the world with a combined GDP of over $3 trillion, and that's expected to even double by 2050. Now, the World Bank itself has estimated that we are looking at a sharp rise in intracontinental exports by over 81%, and even exports of non-African countries or exports to non-African countries would rise by over 19%. And talking about development finance institutions, the UNDP, which is the United Nations Development Program. Now, they address issues of development over the world, and of course, Africa is a continent of interest for them. Now, they've asserted that AfCFTA for them is not just a question of liberalizing trade. For them, they see it as what will enable inclusive growth and even help to accelerate recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. And so very recently, just a couple of weeks ago, they signed some memorandum of understanding, as it were, with the AfCFTA Secretariat, where they gave a grant of $3 million to enhance advocacy among policymakers, business, and other stakeholders as well. And just looking very briefly at all the development indicators, trade, GDP, and even population of global trade. As you can see here, these are the current statistics. All of this is expected to rise, all as a result of the impact of AfCFTA in the coming years and decades. And again, this diagram, as it were, shows you the current status of ratification. The gray shows all the countries that have signed. The red shows the ones which have not just signed but gone ahead to ratify. And then for those who essentially have had that ratification approved, it's essentially the entire continent, as you see here, apart from Eritrea, just top there, who is pushing very strongly to also ensure that they sign and, of course, subsequently ratify the agreement. Now, to look at some of the key issues in relation to AfTA, anyone who has been following developments would know that one of the biggest issues at the time that AfTA was signed in March 2018 was that the two biggest economies on the continent just refused to sign the agreement, and that's Nigeria and South Africa. They eventually signed, but there's this feeling that there is a lack of institutional support from these two very crucial economies in Africa. And speaking to Nigeria, where I come from, the general feeling at the time, was that since Nigeria was already trading, significantly with the rest of Africa, they didn't see what advantage, as it were, it would have. On the flip side, what they thought was that it would mean that quite a number of goods from other countries would come and be dumped in Nigeria, and a lot of Nigerian producers would not be able to compete. There was a lot of stakeholder engagement, and eventually the government came around and they signed on to AfTA. But there's just that general feeling that, Nigeria and South Africa have not fully bought into the vision of AfTA. And then another key issue is that trade has commenced. I mean, on January 1st, 2021, all the countries that have signed up to AfTA effectively commenced. Now, this is largely symbolic because there are still lots of issues that need to be solved. For example, agreeing on rules of origin, which obviously impact on how tariffs will be applied. Even the Secretary General has acknowledged that this remains a challenge, although he then mentioned that at least 81% of tariff lines have been agreed, and to that extent, in respect of those ones, trade could continue. Of course, talking about tariff lines, they still need to eliminate certain tariff lines over a period of time. The target is that, over a 5-year period commencing from 2020, 90% of tariff lines will be eliminated. And a lot more, over the next 5 years after that would also be eliminated. Now, what are the opportunities for international trade partners? Well, first, we are looking at a continental customs union, which is potentially huge. I mean, I've read lots of articles that say that AfTA could really be the game changer. I mean, acknowledging first that it's the largest free trade area in the world. So if we have a customs union where you have the same custom tariffs all around the region and goods can move freely through the entire African region, it then means that those who export goods to Africa are looking at, a potential market of over 1.3 billion people that they can market their goods to completely unhindered, just because they are all part of this free trade area. Again, we see the wide scope of AfTA come into play, so that it doesn't just address issues in relation to trade in goods and services, but you can have unified policies in relation to investment, intellectual property rights, competition policy. Of course, I expect that will be tremendous opportunities for those who want to invest in Africa. And then the cross-sector impact. The World Bank has estimated that 90% of countries will see volume of services grow under AfTA. And that's not surprising, because once the volume of trade goes, then clearly the services that accompany it would also grow. Okay. And then we're looking at over 60% growth in the value of output of agricultural and manufacturing goods as well. So there are tremendous opportunities for international trade. Now, what are some of the challenges of implementing AfTA? Well, I would speak to weak infrastructure, and this is very important. Even the Secretary General of AfTA recently, in an interview he gave to the Financial Times, spoke about how if you don't have roads and the right equipment, that the customs will use at the border, then clearly it's going to reduce the meaningfulness of AfTA. And this is so true. For a country like Nigeria, infrastructure is a big issue. And if we are going to take on the volume of trade that will come from AfTA, we need to improve on that infrastructure. And that's the same across board in many African countries. There's also the issue of movement and visa restrictions. And it's amazing how, you need a visa to get into most African countries, even as an African, so take the top two economies in Africa, Nigeria and South Africa, you need a visa as a Nigerian to go to South Africa. And if you compare this to Europe, particularly members of the European Union, what you see is there's just free movement. I mean, even you as an outsider coming to Europe, if you get a Schengen visa, you can easily move from one European country to the other. Now, that's not the case in Africa. You need visas to move around to many African countries, even as an African. And this has sought to be addressed in the protocol to the Treaty on Establishment of Africa Economic Community. It speaks to free movement of goods, right of residence, and right of establishment. Now, you remember what I said about AfCFTA, where practically all the countries on the continent have signed it. Now, since January 18, when this was signed, it requires 15 member states to ratify it for it to come into force. As we speak today, only Rwanda has fully ratified it. And the question is why? African countries tend to be a bit territorial about people coming into their country. Issues in relation to security, trade protectionism. It's a critical issue for African countries. So something must give. If you say you want a free trade area along the entire continent, that definitely has to go with free movement and very limited visa restrictions, if at all. So that's something that obviously still needs to be addressed. Now, going with the issue of free movement and visa restrictions is also the issue of connectivity. So essentially looking at how easy is it for you to connect one African country to another African country, even if you have a visa. And that's another major challenge that we have in Africa. African countries are not connected in terms of transport infrastructure. They're not properly connected. And so clearly that's something that needs to be addressed if we are looking at a free trade area where you expect goods and services and even people to be able to move freely within that region. Now, the single African air transport market tries to address this such that all the tariff barriers, as it were, for airlines to operate from one African country to another African country will be removed. I mean, very recently, one of the largest airlines in Nigeria was complaining about how it pays tens of thousands of dollars to land any aircraft in a particular African country. And one of the expectations is that the single African air transport market would seek to address some of these issues. Of course, some of the smaller countries have opposed this initiative. Essentially, the argument is that the big airlines will come and take over the entire market, leaving very little for the small airlines. But at least so far, 34 African countries have signed up, to this till date. Now, there's also the issue about uneven distribution of cost and benefit among member states. But personally, I'm not too worried about this, okay, because if the signatories of AfCFTA is anything to go by, irrespective of the smaller countries who think that they might not have as much benefits in AfCFTA, which again is an arguable point because it might even be the smaller countries that will benefit more. But I mean, at least going by the number of countries that have signed up to AfCFTA, clearly everyone seems to be very, very eager, and optimistic about the potentials of AfCFTA. And so in conclusion, notwithstanding these challenges to implementing AfCFTA, the potential gains are enormous. Like Adela said, over 1 billion people, combined GDP of, over $3 trillion. And we're beginning to see trading partners, with African countries take position so that they can benefit from AfCFTA. Hopefully it takes off as we all expect. So strategic partnerships will be key in taking advantage of the unique benefits that AfCFTA will contribute to global trade. Thank you very much and I'll be happy to take any questions that you have.